I was hoping we could start with you sharing a brief narrative of your trajectory through both academia and policy as a bit of background.
I think my getting into policy was probably all serendipitous. When I was growing up, I decided to be a physicist, and I wanted to be a physicist, teach in a university, and so I did that. It's a great career. A faculty member in a university like Rice is just a wonderful way to spend your time. And so I had great students, did research in theoretical physics, and got some grants and wrote some papers, and just had a terrific career. Pretty much all of it here at Rice, except for research leaves. And then I sort of stumbled into university administration, and I had a chance to be chancellor of a campus in Colorado Springs, University of Colorado at Colorado Springs. It was a great occasion. I'd never even been a dean, so this was a chance to explore something that I really didn't have any great interest in pursuing, because the normal route is you become a dean, then you become a provost or vice president, then become a chancellor or president. By then my research would have all been gone, and so I didn't want to do that. But this was sort of just came out of the blue, and so I thought, why not? If they take a chance on me, I'll do that. And I really enjoyed it. It was a great experience, very fast learning experience, the state system. Then Rice, though, hired a new president, brought me back as provost. So that was also unexpected and not on my career path. And I continued to do research and did less teaching as provost, but I continued to do research and have postdocs. And then I've been provost 7 years, and White House calls and says, are you interested in this National Science Foundation job? And the timing was good. It's a great agency, doing good things in science, engineering, research, and education. And so I thought, put me on the list. And so they go through a long list, and eventually you may or may not end up being asked to do it. But I was asked to do it, had a wonderful time there, 5 years, and then the President Clinton, who appointed me, asked me to move to the White House as his science advisor, and that gets you involved more broadly in the science, engineering, technology policy, education, underrepresentation, all kinds of issues, everything that is important to the nation, science, engineering, and technology, enterprise. And then once I finished that, Rice asked me to come back as a university professor and work here in the Baker Institute. So I spend most of my time working, most of my time is probably not here, it's probably around, because I'm still involved in national policy activities, but I really enjoy working at the Baker Institute. So there was no decision tree, there was no plan to go into administration. My plan at the age of 12 was to be a physicist, teach in a fine university, and that's as far as I had ever thought, and so the rest of it just comes along.
Well, given your really lifelong career in academia and STEM and policy, what changes have you noticed over time in women's position within STEM?
Well, when I was studying, the issue of women and the representation of women in science, especially a field like physics, wasn't being talked about. It just was the reality that you looked around in the classroom and there weren't any women, or one from time to time. And to be honest, I don't think I thought about it other than recognizing it. I probably assumed at that stage that young women weren't interested in physics, and that's just the way it was. I certainly didn't observe discrimination or bias, and it wasn't being discussed. Over time, I think we recognize there really is a lot of bias in the system. There still is today, and it's complicated. Some of it is intentional, some is not. Some has to do with our culture and our value system, but it's there. And I would say what's changed is over time we really recognize that, and agencies like the National Science Foundation have tried to play an appropriate role in raising the attention of all of us to the issues, and then trying to actually invest funding in various programs to try to make a difference. The other change that's occurred more recently is women really have made considerable progress in science, engineering, technology. It certainly feels like chemistry, biology, social sciences, psychology, and sociology. being, I think over half the undergraduate majors now, or undergraduate degrees are women. Not yet in physics, not in computer science, not in mathematics. But the direction has been upward.
It has.
Some fields more steeply growing than others, but it's been better. But there's still plenty of data to show that women are not represented, fully represented in all aspects of STEM. So still a lot of work to do.
That's part of the problem I've seen, because you have national average of about 50% female PhDs, 40 to
Right.
50 in STEM heavy fields. And then
Right.
once you move out into associate professor level positions and on upward within academia, the
Goes
drop
down.
off is
Yeah.
ridiculous. However, you do see a lot of women moving into industry and perhaps into policy. I'm not so sure there. But I'm wondering if you've noticed any distinction between your experience with women in academia and how that environment would differ for them from something like industry or maybe for government or policy.
I don't have the experience in industry to be able to make the direct comparison. I'm not sure industry does better than academia, that there are arguments on both
Mm-hmm.
sides of that. There are a number of examples of women now in top leadership positions in corporations and in private philanthropic foundations. The newly announced head of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is a woman, former chancellor of one University of California campus at San Francisco, as I recall. So there are many examples like that. There are also many examples of university presidencies held by women who really did extraordinarily good job in those positions. So that's all changed. But I also know, and I only know what I read, I guess, and get in talking with other people, there still are biases in our system, the academic system. There are clearly biases in the private sector as well, and in government, I think. It's because I think some of these, especially the biases that are hard to pinpoint, and where the individual doesn't recognize he or she is biased. You may remember a study done 2 years ago, maybe, I can't remember. Yale University faculty did the following kind of study. They sent out a job advertisement for a lab manager, and I guess they sent half of them out to some mixture of men and women, senior faculty in major universities, to just assess the merits of appointing this person, salary, and would you hire them or not. The only difference was half of the ones that went out were named, I think, John was the subject, others were Jennifer. And the results came back were just striking. And John was favored for a position and higher salary, and by women evaluators as well as men evaluators. So it's not, that part is not a male-female thing, it's deeper, it's ingrained in society. And I'm sure if you talk to the people that did those ratings, I'm not aware that there were follow-ups, they would say things like, well, yes, I guess I probably did hedge a little bit because Jennifer raised a family, or there are issues that are woman-specific that influenced me in my judgment, but of course that's the issue, and that's part of the issue. So it's a kind of bias. It's not all mean bias. In fact, maybe most of it isn't. But it's there, nonetheless. And even if you're not concerned about equity from some larger view about our social culture and what's the correct thing to do, we're missing a lot of talent by having these barriers, complicated as they may be, in the way of women to be all that they can be, to do all that they can be. And there are things that can be done.
What do you think those things are?
Well, I think in universities, many universities have been coping with this challenge for a very long time. And I know we were starting to worry about it and take some steps back when I was a provost. That's over 20 years ago now. But many of our universities have changed the tenure clock. They've allowed time for caregiving. There are programs, I already mentioned the National Science Foundation has a number of programs focused on the gender discrimination issue and equity issue. One of them is the Advance program, and we have a very active advance effort here on the Rice campus. And that's, I don't know enough about the details of the program to describe it, but the way I think about it is it's a place. It's a place where women in science, engineering, mathematics, related fields can go to learn about one another's experiences, to maybe learn about things going on in the universities that they didn't immediately observe, to hear about something that Yale is doing that Rice ought to be doing. So it's at least a place, and I think it encourages. I hear from young women faculty that it's encouraging, that it's helpful, provides a support structure. I'm sure there are many other things, but I just give a few examples. There are some things yet to do.
And I think you mentioned that there's a double standard, definitely, between male and female expectation technically. So in terms of competence, you have a woman having to be twice as competent within a STEM-related field to be taken half as seriously as a male counterpart. And I'm wondering...
I'm not sure half and half is
have
the
you
right
seen that? How do
ratio.
you...
But there may be research that shows that it's half and
it varies
half.
across
Yeah,
fields.
certainly it's real.
Mm-hmm.
And it's significant. And if you, the ratios like halves, I mean, if you look at, compare the number of, you'll know what statistics are right here, but certainly in terms of the fraction of the population that are women compared to the fraction of the population in STEM fields, that ratio is very much lower for women than for men, maybe by a factor of 2 lower or half. So the numbers are large. I agree, and you probably know them better than I.
Do you think if we increase the numbers of women in STEM alone, that a lot of the problems they face in terms of biases, both outright and unspoken, will fade away on their own, or are there upper-level policy changes that we need to be implementing?
It's probably both. The most powerful, I suspect, would be peer, not pressure so much, but peer support, and several things happen by bringing more women into the teaching workforce and the working workforce. Not that teaching isn't working. Having mentors around, role models, all of that gets better. While at the same time, the institution that women are a part of, whether it's a university or a company, just gains a better understanding of what steps it should take to ensure that it's attracting the very best women and as many as it can, because it's going to be in the interest of the company or the university to do that. Some of these things still tend to be in the abstract and harder for males to get, and some females probably, who made it the hard way, who came up and who just said, I don't care that the room's full of men and they don't like me, I'm going to do it anyway. Well, I know women who have had such careers, and they're sort of trailblazers, but some of them may not really be quite as sensitive to what can be done better to bring in young women today. So I think it will help to work at it from both directions. Top down, never really works very well on anything. So it kind of has to be top down, bottom up, and so there's too many ways to ignore top down or sidestep it or reject and rebel against it, because having been in an organization where things were coming from the top, I can speak from experience, not in the case of bias or discrimination in particular, but just all kinds of things. Suppose you want to have a new program in your university for X, and there don't happen to be any faculty interested in X. It's just not going to work.
You mentioned a moment ago about those women you may have interacted with who were just trailblazers, and they said, I don't care what anybody thinks, the room's full of men, I'm just going to do my thing. And I'm wondering if you think that type of approach is characteristic of female success in male-dominated areas. So is bold, complete assertion, steamroll, trailblazer type attitude, is that something you've noticed as being more successful?
I can't say from experience. My bias is that that's the case. Okay. Just because we know from the research that has been done what uncomfortable a climate there can be just on the experiences that women have had in certain kinds of departments, certain fields. Certain fields get pointed to as worse in this regard than other fields. So I have to believe that, I do believe that these women have experienced these kind of cool climate, and that has consequences probably far beyond what the males in the same department realize. But I think it's real. So I sort of have to believe then that in those fields, those departments, those companies, those institutions, that the women that have really made it to the top didn't make it to the top by just being nice and smile, and they really had to be tough.
I was hoping we could also hear your perspective as a male on the double standard in assertiveness and in that trailblazing path, because you have studies out there that show that a male who would be more confident or assertive or speak up in a meeting, etc., would be received better than a woman who would do the exact same thing. So that assertion would be labeled as shrill or
aggressive. Right? Aggressive is a favorite term.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't experienced that consciously anyway. Who knows what I may have experienced that I wasn't really fully aware of in those kind of environments. I certainly have heard that, and I certainly have been in classrooms where women were noticeably quieter for whatever reason. And so most of the conversations with the men. And so you could say, well, that's because they're more assertive and they're quick to take the floor. In some cases that is true. But at the same time, if in those circumstances women don't actually participate, it's difficult then to hear their voices. And I think it's true. It's not just a matter of culture, not just a matter of gender. Sometimes also a matter of culture. Some countries don't encourage women in their particular ethnic group to get out in front. But it does remind me that one thing that I think was learned in the MIT study a number of years ago, when Chuck Vest, who sadly died this year, was president of that institution, and with the leadership, the women on that campus, they did some study and found salary bias in that case. Clear by every measure, the women were being paid less than the men. No matter what you corrected for, they were just being paid less. And part of the interpretation, as I remember the report, I haven't read it recently, but part of the reason I think was back to the point you just made, but a different aspect of that when men want to get a salary, the finding is that in many cases when men want to get their salary boosted up, they get offers and they pursue them. When women get a call, would you be interested in this position, they immediately think of family and the spouse and other kinds of situations, and often don't pursue it. If they don't pursue it, they don't take it seriously, they can't really leverage their salary up with it either, because that's generally salary increases, for right or wrong, are substantial in efforts to retain faculty, men or women, but that's just the reality. So if the women are less inclined to use this mechanism, they're just going to fall behind. There may be other things that were discussed in the report that were viewed as being biased, intentional or unintentional. I don't remember, but I do remember that particular matter about salary and pursuing offers from other institutions.
I'm wondering if you can speak to that, the climate of assertion within academia, and if you noticed it in policy or in the government among the women you worked with there. So have you seen more success in assertive women in that type of political climate, policy, government, or does it lend itself better to academia?
I don't. Most of the women I know are assertive, so I don't have a category. And I mean that in the most positive sense. Direct and responsive and friendly and helpful and engaging. I mentioned to you when we were talking offline that I gave a presentation to the Rosalind Franklin Society board this last December, and I was very concerned about what it was I was going to say that hasn't already been said by people with more experience. and said in a better way, and I couldn't think of anything. And then finally I decided what I'm going to do is, first of all, tell the group that I recognize you all know more about these issues than I do, but since I have the floor, I decided to tell you about particular women who helped me in my jobs in Washington and what they did. And I started to make a list. It was long. I mean, it was 2 pages of names of women who were in important positions in the federal government during that time. That was the Clinton administration. And Bill Clinton certainly made it a point to reach out to women and other groups that were unrepresented in those positions. And so I worked with a lot of women in the Pentagon, Commerce Department, at National Science Foundation, NIST, used to do the National Bureau of Standards. I mean, many, many examples on several levels, but they were all high levels. And quickly coming to mind were specific things I needed. Trouble I was having. Big trouble sometimes, or smaller trouble. And because we had a very good relationship, sort of a networking, I could go to coffee with the person in the Pentagon who could help me and explain what the problem was, and she, in this case, had a solution. Let's try thus and so. And sure enough, she called together the admirals and the generals, and we got it all worked out, got the problem solved. Similar Commerce Department. Were these women assertive? Yes, I mean, they were articulate, they were smart, but nothing negative I could say about any of them. I mean, even if we were speaking privately, there was nothing negative. There was nothing I thought inappropriate, or this person's trying too hard, or this person wants to be meaner than the person next to them. There's nothing like that. They were just doing their job, and they didn't need to help me. I mean, so part of this time I was at the National Science Foundation. They were in the Pentagon. One of them was in the Pentagon. One's in the Commerce Department. They didn't really need to take on this extra task. So when I thought about what was the common thread that ran through all those experiences, it really was that. None of them, I never got the impression, single impression, in any of those cases, that that woman was thinking about how this was going to help them in their position or in their career. In some cases it didn't. I mean, if it had been terribly damaging, they might have told me to go jump in the lake. I mean, this life's hard enough in Washington, so I don't want to overstate it, but they just were being responsible. They just felt that that while they were in their position in the federal government, they had a responsibility to do the very best job they could for America. I mean, and if that meant helping somebody in another agency in a way that they could, because of their own affiliation, they would do that. So, you know, these women, it's just a sampling, but it's my sampling, were certainly effective and efficient. They did their homework, and until I had sat down to make those lists, I'd only thought from time to time about one or another person I'd worked with, but I hadn't actually put it all together, and when I did, I was really very impressed and thankful.
Did you recognize that collaborative spirit between the women themselves, or is there any element of contention or animosity or competition since their numbers are fewer?
I often would leave the room, so when the women were doing the work together, so I don't know that I would be in a position to observe. And by that I meant when I was director of the National Science Foundation, I had a woman, Ann Peterson was her name, who was deputy director of the foundation. The deputy director is really the chief operating officer. So when I said I would leave the room, it didn't mean I didn't care. It meant to be respectful of the position that she has, and that she's going to do this job, and Neil doesn't need to get in the way. So whether there were any issues, I never heard any feedback. Ann Peterson was a wonderful person, a psychologist by profession, did a great job, and so I never heard any comments to the contrary. I also saw agency to agency interactions between women working in different agencies. So I don't know what might have gone on in a room at a given time, but the output was excellent. The result of them working together, and I say them because there are quite a number of women in high positions. So there were examples where 2 or 3 women were actually working through a particularly difficult problem that went across agencies. So all I know is the outcome was really good. So I have to feel that the discussion was good as well, and they worked well together.
Did you recognize any differences in the types of outcomes that would arise if women tackled a problem and their approaches than if men had done the same?
Dangerous territory to try to tread.
Yeah.
But I'm not aware of anything like that. I can imagine issues in which women, because of their life's experiences, would have a special perspective and would recognize an opportunity to do something, an option that men might not think of. But I'm not. I can't put my finger on any of them except maybe one. And the National Science Foundation has been trying for years to establish a child care center, because there are many women on the support staff and the professional staff and the research staff, program officers, who have children, little children. And Washington's a complicated place, and you don't want your child care center over here if you've got to go to work over here. But it just didn't make economic sense, apparently, in prior years. I encouraged that effort when I got there. I said, let's just try to do it. So that's the only role that I played in this. But there were some women in the foundation who were particularly interested in this issue and worked hard at it and got it done, figured out how to do it. One of the major problems was you had to charge tuition because you couldn't use appropriated money. And some of our support staff, salaried staff, really couldn't afford significant tuition. So we put together a scholarship program for little kids, and essentially were able to bring in a broader population of young people, and it worked. But those ideas came out of people working on it. They weren't all women, but many of the leaders were women. And I wasn't surprised. I think that makes sense. But I'm sure there are many other areas where that's the case, because women's perspective often is different. They have lived a different life than men, and it's another argument for diversity. You want as many perspectives at the table when you're doing important work as you can possibly get. Certainly includes gender diversity, but ethnicity as well.
Do you think not only in differences in what perspective can bring to outcome, but did you recognize any differences, big differences in character among female and male leaders you interacted with?
No, the data set is so small. Sometimes your most difficult problems are personnel issues. People who just, first of all, who do something wrong, maybe illegal, whether it's inadvertent or not, and sometimes just really bad judgment. The numbers, I'm happy to say, of those kind of situations I had to deal with were not very large. And some were women, some were men. So I think I couldn't really, I couldn't on the basis of that experience suggest that there is any significant difference. I think sometimes, again, based on a small data set, probably unfair, I found the men sometimes a little sloppier in dealing with their travel statements and things that if you're not careful, make a mistake that can end up being illegal, and you'll find the Justice Department on your case. And so just the instances that I can think of, again, it's just a very small. Men appear to be not so careful in the detail. I couldn't expand that to any kind of generality, I think, except my wife actually takes care of all our finances, including the taxes and so forth. So it comes very close to home. I mean, she has been extraordinary in taking care of all of those kinds of things.
Do you think, with regard to the females you worked with in Washington, that they displayed that type of meticulousness, attention to detail, inherently, so women are more tending towards that type of behavior, or is it the case that those positions required a woman to be more of that ilk than a comparable man, and you wouldn't hire a woman who is as sloppy as a
Hard to
man?
know, you know, chicken
Yeah.
and egg.
Yeah.
Presidential appointments are already complicated and multidimensional because I believe we had a wonderful team during the Clinton administration. I think the Obama team has been extraordinary in science, engineering, technology, math. And there certainly were appointments in both Bush administrations that I thought were excellent. But I think maybe not to the same degree in terms of numbers and team effort and so forth. So I'm very proud of what the Clinton team was able to do. So it's hard to judge because when a president decides to make an appointment, we may have a woman president. I mean, that might not be a bad idea. The president has to weigh a lot of considerations. First of all, the president has this long list of supporters who were there for him or her in the campaign. And generally, presidents want to make appointments, so they don't have enough ambassadorships to pass around. They don't have enough presidential committees for people to be on and so forth. So they're looking for places. The White House Personnel Office always looking for places to put these people. And so it's a political consideration. And it means that the best person for a particular job won't always get that job.
Right, okay.
Because there are going to be other considerations. So there's a kind of chicken egg here thing. And what my experience is, though, that the women I worked with in government did their homework. When I asked them to do something, a request, they were not all working for me, I don't mean. I made a request. They didn't forget it. I mean, they remembered it. We're just having coffee or lunch, and they remembered it, and they came back to it. Sylvia Matthews is, at the present time, is the director of the Office of Management and Budget for President Obama. When I was in the White House, Sylvia was deputy director of Office of Management and Budget. Those are tough jobs. So there's a human who has to keep the entire federal budget in some extraordinary detail in her head all the time, and often answer tiny questions about pieces of it. And I was really impressed that given all that she had to wrestle with, on the occasion when I needed some information, and we'd just catch one another after a morning staff meeting, just passing in the hall almost, she remembered what it was I asked her, and she said she would get back to me, and she got back to me. Don't know if that's can be generalized across whole gender discussions of comparisons between male and female, but my experience was that the women I worked with took their job really very seriously, were not thinking about themselves. If they were, I hope everybody thinks about themselves, but certainly they were not making every judgment with that kind of assessment, and tended to do what they said they would do, which meant remembering, first of all, what the request was, remembering when they got back to the office with a pile of whatever on their desk to make sure that it got looked into by somebody or other, and then make sure that they got back to me. Those are simple, those are, doing that is more complicated than it seems. Even now I find where I don't have handlers, I don't have schedulers, and so I'm doing it all myself, trying not to make mistakes. Those three or four pieces. So you get an email asking a question, a lot of emails every day, asking a question. I don't know, if I know the answer, that's done. If I don't know the answer, then I've got to remember to get the answer, and then I've got to remember to get back. And so people have all kinds of different ways of doing that, but you have to do it. If you don't do all those steps, then you're viewed as not reliable and not responsive, and man or woman. So sometimes when I'm talking with students, and they ask for advice on what they should do, say something like the following: that you've got to remember in your career, you're going to be doing things that you don't know right now. Opportunities are going to be presented to you at various stages in your career, and you'll have to make a decision. Often those opportunities, almost always, are created by people you know or have known. Thesis advisors, fellow faculty, fellow students, students in your class. I mean, you never know. And so I said, whenever you're dealing with people, be nice. And then, of course, I say by be nice, I don't just mean be pleasant. But if you tell somebody you're going to do something for them, do it. If you tell them you're going to get back to them by the end of the day, do it. It goes a long way in terms of building trust and support and respect, actually. And then when they get a phone call saying who would be good at this or that job, they think of your name. And they may think of other names also, but that's how people get recommended for things. And so it's important to keep that in mind all along the way, because they're forming those impressions right now as undergraduates at Rice, and of course even before they got to Rice.
Before we change gears a little bit about the portrait of success, male or female, I was wondering if you're comfortable and don't mind speaking briefly to the role that appearance plays in success for women, both either in Washington in government or within academia.
I think it's pretty clear from all the research that has been done that parents play an extremely important role. That said, two kids raised in the same household, one's very successful, one fails. Sometimes in the most catastrophic way, and other times just in disappointing ways. So people are complicated, and parenting is complicated. But and not having, I can only reflect on my own experiences and then books I've read, but my own experiences, neither of my parents had college education. They grew up in the Depression years. My mother came from a farm, became a nurse, so she had a career. My father grew up in the oil fields, made his career in the oil industry. So they hadn't experienced higher education, but they encouraged me from day one to get as much education as I possibly could. It was in their culture. It, at least in my mother's case, maybe in my father's case also, knowledge was valued in the home. She came from the German side, German immigration, so it goes all the way back into German and Russian culture. But wherever it goes or wherever it came from, she was very positive about knowledge, for knowledge's sake, and getting the very best education. And I saw them sacrifice. Neither of them made much money, but to send me to the best school they could and afford, and to deny themselves things to make that happen. Of course, I didn't realize it when I was little, but you look back and you see it later. So when you grow up in that kind of environment, I've got to believe if I were, instead of Neil, I were Cordelia or something, that I would have had exactly the same experience, because they showed no, in the rest of their, in their lives, they showed no bias against women or no prejudice against anyone for race or gender or color. So I just feel confident it wouldn't have made any difference. But when you grow up in that environment, you just naturally end up viewing knowledge as important and education as important, even if you don't quite know why. And I decided I'd be a physicist, and they didn't ask me to be a physicist when they heard I wanted to be a physicist. That's great. What can we do to help you? So you grow up just valuing knowledge without thinking about it so much. And then when you see your parents make that investment in you, you by God don't want to disappoint them. Even if they have never applied any pressure on you, even if they were not critical of your grade point average or something. I mean, when my first semester in university, I made a 2.8, all B's and a C. C was in government, so I knew right away I was ready for government. I was going to be a public servant in Washington. You can imagine how that struck me. Of course, I was heartbroken to make horrible grades. I considered horrible grades. But they were encouraging. They said you could get better. I mean, just this is new environment, and takes some getting used to. And fortunately, it did get better. My wife grew up in a family. Neither of her parents had college education. They had different careers, but no money. I mean, to make much money. They strongly encouraged her to get her education. Where did that come from? I don't know. I mean, it was in them. So I think it's very anecdotal, and only a couple of data set of two, plus us raising our own children, and now trying to keep up with our grandchildren. We have those experiences. I have to believe it's very important. But things can go wrong with all the best efforts for boys or girls growing up in households due to things about the brain we don't understand, or things in the community, bad role models, bad luck for family, all kinds of things. Life isn't fair. I mean, there's nothing fair about life. It's what we have, and we make of it what we can. So I think parenting is extremely important. You will always find counterexamples where a kid grew up in a horrible home and did extraordinary things. And on the other side, a kid grew up in a wonderful home and could never really make it.
Parenting is a facet of this issue I haven't even thought about. I meant to ask about appearance of women.
Oh.
As physical
I'm sorry, I
appearance
thought
and
you said
exterior.
parents.
No.
Oh, yeah. Well, you can scratch all this about parenting then.
That was very interesting, though. Thank you for sharing.
No, I cringe about appearance, the issue of appearance of women. The reason I cringe is that occasionally I pick up an article that is giving advice to women on how to succeed in business. And it's what to do and what not to do and what to wear and what not to wear, and so I, I don't have any experience, so I can't say whether that's valuable or not. The person who wrote the article might say, well, you might not like it, but this is the real world, and what I'm doing is just telling women how it is. So I guess it makes a difference. And I actually think it probably makes a difference for men as well. I doubt you can make it big in a corporation if you ignore the standards of dress. I would have no way to compare whether somehow the rigors for women are different from the rigors of men. I don't know the answer to that, but I do know there are women advising women on how to succeed in business, and at least a piece of that has to do with dress. And then a piece of it has to do with don't be aggressive. So yes, so I don't, I worry about the fact that probably that is the reality that's being addressed in certain companies and university campuses and departments. So even though university departments are generally not do not exercise high standards of dress, certainly with the males.
What about within the scientific community and the scientific research community? Does appearance and aesthetics matter to women's credibility?
I'm not. I can't think of any examples, and I'm not aware of any examples. You could imagine, could speculate that if you got a lab in which everybody's got jeans and T-shirts, and the woman wears high heels, and okay. But the same would be true if a man came in a suit and tie every day, and everybody else had jeans and T-shirts. So I think it might be a hard thing to measure, and I have no data on the subject.
Maybe now we can address policy issues in STEM and how they can affect women going forward. And I'm wondering, we've already spoken a bit about your time in Washington, and just so I can get a sense of the dynamic there, what percentage of the people you worked with were female?
When I was in Washington. I've never sat down to calculate it, but in my time at NSF, at least as many women, and probably more, in policy circles. Now that was the Clinton administration, and he made a number of women appointments in important jobs. So, so my counterparts, people I work most closely with in the White House, was during my NSF days before I went to the White House, Marcy Greenwood. Marcy Greenwood was Associate Director for Science in the Office of Science Technology Policy. Marcy, after leaving government, then became Chancellor of the University of California at Santa Cruz, I think, then Vice President for the system, then President of the University of Hawaii, and is now back at her original campus in California, Davis. Extraordinary person to work with, pushed through a whole science policy for the Clinton administration. The Undersecretary of Commerce for Technology was Mary Good. Mary Good made her career in chemistry at Allied Chemical, and Mary was extraordinary to work with, and then went on to be Dean of Engineering at the University of Arkansas because Arkansas was her home. So that's when she went back. Anita Jones was, I can't remember the exact title, but she was essentially in charge of all research and development in the Pentagon. And she's a Rice alum, actually, and has received a Distinguished Alumni Award from us a number of years ago. She helped me solve some serious problems and so forth. So there were some males. Harold Armas was director of NIH during that time. Ernie Moniz, he's now head of the Cancer Institute. Ernie Moniz is now Secretary of Energy. I worked with him as Undersecretary of Energy during those days. So there were certainly a number of men in the administration, but it's striking how many women are in those positions. If you try to average over several decades of appointments, I don't know what the numbers look like, but I think in the Obama administration and the Clinton administration, particularly a large fraction of those high-level appointments were women. Many people inside the NSF I worked with who ran the directorates were women, but the majority were not. So inside NSF you have a director, and he's not really at the top, he's at the bottom, but anyway, here's the director. Then the people reporting to him are called assistant directors. Math, physical sciences, biosciences, engineering, computer information technology, social behavioral sciences, and so geosciences. Only one of those during my time there was a woman, Mary Clutter, who was head of the biosciences directorate. There were heads of offices in the professional offices who were women, and so I worked with many women in the foundation, but I would say we were not balanced inside the agency. I recommended the first woman deputy director for the National Science Foundation. That was Ann Peterson, who I mentioned earlier. That's a presidential appointment, so I had to recommend it to the White House, and she was then named by the president. And I also recommended the first woman director of the National Science Foundation. That was Rita Caldwell. And by the time that was happening, I was moving over to the White House. So I was the person who would be recommending directly to the president who should be the next director. So sort of in that interim, I certainly recommended Rita for that job. As you probably know, the new director of the National Science Foundation, Franz Cordova, who was today the third, she was confirmed yesterday. It took a long time to get Senate confirmation, but she had her swearing in, yesterday. And I worked with her in Washington when I was there because she was at that time chief scientist for NASA. So there's another example of a woman in high places during the Clinton administration. So I would have to say women did very well in policy positions at that time. Even the Defense Department, Commerce Department, Energy as well had at various times had women, not as undersecretary or secretary. I mean, after Hazel O'Leary left, then the next couple of secretaries were men in the Clinton administration. But Hazel O'Leary was maybe the first woman Secretary of Energy early, and that was early in the Clinton administration.
And the numbers you've seen within the physics community and academia, have they been drastically less than numbers of women in policy in that sphere, or just?
I think, policy is a big universe, so I saw part of it. Certainly the part I saw, I thought women were very well represented and did an excellent job. So that is just a good story. but policy runs all the way down through all these federal agencies. And you go down through the Pentagon and EPA, and I just don't have any idea what the numbers are like. Be interesting to know. Good question. Physics, the numbers are still small. Physics, math, computer science, geosciences, don't know if we've made progress there or not. Rice has had women on the physics faculty for a long time. Not when I first joined the faculty, but for a long time. Now, Marge Corcoran may have been the first woman on the Rice physics faculty. I'm not quite sure. Then when the departments combined, there were women in the astronomy, space physics, and astronomy department that came together. Now there are a number of women on the physics faculty. So that's just Rice. But when I visit other institutions, I often talk with women on the faculty, and my sense is the situation is much better there as well. So it's better. In computer science, I can't speak from experience, but I happened to look at the study that was done not long ago, because there's some concern why women are not going into computer science. And there was an uptick back before the crash, before the market crash, but women had not. There were still many more men than women. And then all the interest went down after 2007, 8, 9, in that period. Then they went up again, but the real growth was men in computer science. And there's been some increase in women. I'm talking about baccalaureate degrees, the only numbers I remember. The numbers of women coming in are greater, but the growth is not nearly as large as it is for men. Why is that? I don't know. Is that a Bill Gates thing or a Steve Jobs thing? I'm not sure what may influence that. It could just all be back to the fact that girls are often told girls don't do math. Girls aren't as good as math as boys in math. Could stem from those early things that a young person will hear or experience, and that even high school counselors, I don't know if they're better, but certainly in earlier years they often did not encourage girls to think about careers that involve math.
Do you think encouraging STEM education in younger women is one of the solutions to getting more women in those fields?
In what, I'm sorry?
Encouraging STEM education in younger women. Would that be one of the keys to getting more women in STEM fields?
Sure.
Okay.
I think that's clearly an important step, but we really have to be cautious when we're encouraging anybody in any career because the job market can just collapse. And we've been through several cycles of that in the United States. That's not gender specific, because in the earlier years there were so few women in STEM fields. We really said we're going to need more scientists and engineers, and programs were put in place, and a lot of people graduated, and then the bottom fell out of the hiring market. So I think two things about that. Three things. One, we really have to be fair with our young people, make sure they know there aren't any guarantees. Nobody knows what kind of a career is going to pay off really well or be satisfying 20 years from now. I believe nobody knows that. There's no way to know. The second thing is that it's very important to think about what you like and what you're good at. And if what you like you're also pretty good at, I think that might be an important guide as to what direction to go. If you're really dead set on making a bundle of money, STEM is not likely to be the way to do that. There are always exceptions, but the probability is not high. But the people who are making the money right now are investment bankers. And then a very small number of entrepreneurs that really did something extraordinary and got in early, and the Bill Gates example. But there are others, but the number is very, very small. So Zuckerberg and Bill Gates, the list is not long. I'm worried about that because I think that tends to influence young people in thinking that they can do that.
Yeah.
Well, it's like playing pro basketball. Yes, but the statistics do not look promising. So I think young people need to first of all, we have to be straight with them about nobody can guarantee the career. Be guided by what you're good at and what you like. with the other considerations. If money's your object, okay, I mean, think about that, be realistic with yourself in choosing a career. And then I think if you want to go on for the PhD, keep in mind that you may well not have a research career just because the numbers don't work for that. All power to you if you want to work for that, because without that kind of passion, the probability is zero. So if that's what you really want in life, go for it. But be ready to recognize there are other opportunities. And on the policy side, especially university policy, make sure that the graduate students have exposure, some exposure, to possible careers other than doing the same thing that their research advisor is doing. And be able to communicate, be able to write, be able to talk, elevator speech, those kind of things. You don't have time in a science PhD program for a lot of that, but you have time for some of that. Business practices, some things that will just give you a foundation that normally our science PhD programs don't have. So there are some policy things you can do, and there's some federal policy things what the National Science Foundation programs support and how they're crafted, and they do the best they can to keep track of where the real needs are and how their programs will help or not help. But change is very fast these days, so you have to be ready for it.
From a budgetary perspective, do you think cuts in funding to NIH and other government agencies would have any effect on women going into STEM fields, or could they be structured differently to encourage more women?
If I were a woman, they would have an effect on me.
Yeah.
I mean, I would worry about that.
Yeah.
And so do the men. It's been a torturous period for everybody, for everything having to do with the federal government, for reasons that we could have another session on, but I'll steer clear of the partisan politics here. To be fair, I guess, to the policymakers, in some average way, the cuts to science are not as deep, have not been as deep as the cuts to other discretionary spending. Many other kinds of, so we haven't done worse somehow than the average. We haven't really done much better either. And then the NIH situation is particularly tragic in a way because of the funding profile, the doubling over 5 years from 98 to 2003, and then downhill until the stimulus money, big bump, $10 billion bump in 2009 that had to be spent quickly over a couple of years, and then back to some inflationary spending again. So how can you manage that, either if you're running an agency or you're in an agency or you're a researcher running proposals? It's very scary, and nobody knows how it's going to go. Nobody I talk with is very optimistic, and I'm not either, over the near term, over the next few years. But I'm working on a project, co-chairing a study of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, focused on the future of science, engineering, technology in America. And a lot of that focus will be on research.
Okay.
And so funding would be a part of it, but there are all kinds of other policy issues in the way of the most effective use of the money. Some of those are institutional, university policies, some are federal policies, some of them are private sector companies, how they interact with universities. So we're looking at, we hope we have some ideas to try to get a long-term focus on this issue and view it as a higher priority than we have done in recent decades.
And when there are funding cuts to that type of budget, do you think directives as to where that money is going to go would focus on something more progressive, like keeping women in STEM, or would it focus on just keeping basic research operations going and the diversity aspects, and paying for that would be kind of the first to go? If budget
I don't know if it would be the first to go, and and remember there are a lot of players.
Yeah.
So sometimes the National Science Foundation, and not to be fair to other agencies, but the National Science Foundation knows that it has a responsibility to pay attention to education and human resources, as well as scientific engineering research. Other agencies don't have that mandate. So even though I know that the Department of Energy cares, and Office of Naval Research and NIH care about women researchers and make changes in their policies to address those needs, They don't really have the mandate.
Okay.
So at NSF, I think every effort would be made by the agency to preserve the most effective programs by whatever metrics they feel are most appropriate that address issues of underrepresentation and STEM education. So we certainly those would not be the first to go.
Okay.
Whether they would take deeper cuts than some of the other things is really complicated, because some of the other fields are tangled up in instrumentation that has to be maintained. Construction projects are underway. You stop funding them for 1 year, suddenly the cost of the whole project doubles, all kinds of considerations like that. So I wouldn't want to judge. But the other thing I would say is NSF doesn't make its own decisions. The White House, well, the White House would encourage NSF to pay attention to education. Congress, a whole other story. There are differences between the parties on these issues, and in the end, an appropriation committee can simply write language into the bill that shuts down the program. The president can, of course, veto the bill, but Congress could override the veto, or the president has to make a judgment on the good versus the not so good, and will often sign bills. All presidents have done this, I think, sign bills they didn't like for one reason or another and live to fight another day. I mean, okay, we'll gulp this down and then we'll come back and deal with it later. So I think if you look at the whole political climate, counting the Congress and how it's behaved, and the administration is very positive on those issues and the agency, I still think we could get hurt on issues like STEM education and diversity. But a lot of it, you can imagine, a lot of effort inside the government, inside the federal government, will be made to ensure that the damage is minimized. But there is a Congress, and they're behaving somewhat differently.
The last topic I wanted to discuss was leadership and how that would relate to women's success in STEM. And I'm wondering what you think is the prevailing definition of leadership within the American public. Not necessarily your own definition, but the widely accepted common definition.
I don't know how to answer that. I think what you'd find is not a bimodal, but a multimodal distribution of responses.
Okay.
Some people are going to describe leadership just in terms of making a lot of money. So the leaders and their views will be, somehow this individual, man or woman, made a huge amount of money. And money is a big thing in this country, and has been for as long as we've had a country, probably. So I don't want to put down any of our good friends in the public, but many in the public will weigh that very highly. However you make the money, and so long as if you make it doing something horrible, Americans don't support that. Yeah. But if you're a movie star, if you're an artist, and you make music, if you run a business, especially if you make things that are cool, if they're cool, and you make a lot of money, I think there are many people in our larger public who view that as leadership. And it would be kind of hard to talk them out of it, because many of those people have emerged as leaders. Even if people didn't like them personally, they emerged as leaders. By leaders, they made things happen. And I think another aspect of leadership would be, public service. So I think President Carter, even for people who didn't like him politically and didn't like his presidency for one reason or other, recognized, because of all the things he's done on behalf of people in other parts of the world and people in the country who have problems, and they view him as a kind of leadership, statement-like leadership. Many people who have high regard for President Clinton, I think it's not because they like all his policies, but I think they think he's trying to get something important done. And Bill Gates, even if you hate Microsoft software, which there are some people who do, not especially like the software. I recognize that that with the foundation, and even in terms of private giving, that there's a man who is doing a lot to change the world in a positive way. So yeah, he made a bundle of money, but he's using that money to make the world a better place. It's a kind of leadership. So it's philanthropy, I guess.
Okay.
So my first part was, you make it big in the profession, and I only emphasized a couple of professions, but the other one, you might make it big as leader in philanthropy, the things you do with your money. Another one would be the military, of course, and I think that that's sort of self-defined. And then one might be in public policy, not so much philanthropy, but service in government. So governors that people like, senators that people like, presidents that people like. Now that's not an answer to the question at all. Those are some of the kinds of people that I think emerge to the public as leaders. But my sense is the proof's in the pudding, in a sense, with the American public. They kind of know it when they see it.
Okay.
There's a leader. Now, if we're more interested in what made that person a leader, then you can look down along the way and see what it is. But as you know, our engineering leadership program does try to find the elements of leadership and make sure that the students explore. My guess is, but I don't know because I haven't looked at your website recently, you don't try to get the students to accept a particular definition of leadership that's much more complicated than that. And it doesn't work the same way for every person because they have different personalities, different personal styles. But it's what the word says. If you're a leader, I don't know, was it Will Rogers anyway? Look over your shoulder from time to time, see if anybody's following you. So leadership is actually leading, and it's leading in establishing your views of what's important in life, maybe on the religious side and morality, or in business, it's leading by making people follow your model, or making your company successful. From policy, it's leading by you get the laws passed. Secretary Baker, when he introduced Leader Pelosi the other evening, they're not of the same party, and Secretary even said, there's a couple of policies on which we don't agree. But then he had very positive things about it. One thing he said is, she gets things done. And so Pelosi's definitely an example of a leader. She gets things done. Everybody won't agree on the things, and some people might not even like being dragged along to get some of the things done that she gets things done. So I don't have if I sat down, maybe I could craft out bullets that I think might work, but you really ask it in the context of what the people think of as leadership, and I can only think of it by examples of who I think they think of as leaders.
Which is an interesting perspective, because in asking that question, I'm wondering to what extent that public definition of leadership influences women's hesitance or perhaps desire to move into those kinds of positions, and how that relationship between the definition of leadership and whether or not women move there and see themselves there and their success there depends on how we're defining leadership. So that was why
I don't know. That's an important thing to wonder about, because you want to encourage young women to go as high as they can. I mean, do all that they can, consistent with their own values and things they want out of life. And there are enough examples where women do rise to high places and then they just get beaten up. Was it their fault? I mean, or not? I don't know the answer. I wasn't there. I wasn't on the board of that company, and I don't know whether this was an example of bad judgment and doing things that were wrong. I just don't know. My point is not to evaluate, but rather those messages get out in the public, and so women might say, well, wait a minute, if I get myself exposed like that, you can imagine that Hillary Clinton is thinking about running for the presidency. I assume she still is thinking about it, and I think would be a fine president. But I'm sure what must go through her mind is, is this what I need in my life at this time? And other women I have known do that. I glanced over my shoulder and saw a picture of Donna Shalala, whom I worked with when she was head of HHS, and Harold Varmus was head of NIH, and I was at that time first in the National Science Foundation and then in the White House. I worked a lot with Donna Shalala. Great to work with, powerful woman, but a good person. I mean, so it is possible to be powerful and to be assertive and to have values. And one of those values would be respect for human beings and for your opinion, whether I agree with it or not, how you treat people, how you make your way in the world. There are examples, I think, of people, maybe men, maybe and women, I don't know, who've made their way up by just knocking everybody out of the way. Once they get to the top, everybody hates them, and as soon as they make the slightest mistake, down they go like a rocket. They're politicians, we all know, who have found themselves in the same situation. So you kind of have to be careful on the way up. There's some old cliches about on the way up and on the way down. You see the same people on the way down, and how you treat them really makes a huge difference. So, but I think there are issues just because of horror stories of women running organizations and then things turning sour for whatever reasons, and that sends a negative signal. And so you can't help but wonder, was that an example of bias, and was that an example where a man would have been treated differently? I don't know. There aren't enough of those cases to really even be able to make an assessment, but it does give you pause. But I believe we need women in science, engineering, technology, and math and medicine. And we need women in high places, in universities and in companies and in government, not just because they're women, but because some of them will bring a different perspective, and we need the best we can get in these jobs. Because frankly, policy is not doing very well right now in companies, in universities, and in government. Lots of problems. Lots of things need fixed, and the inability of any of these three organizations to fix them. So, since I have no experience in the corporate world, I'll steer clear of trying to list the long number of problems that companies have. I know them better in universities, and the list is long. I know them better in the federal government, and the list is long. Same must be true in state government. I see that, but I haven't worked much of my career in state government. I worked a couple of years in Colorado with the state system, and so it just turns out people are complicated, and even one person is kind of complicated. We're trying to understand the brain, and we're not there yet. Two or more people, really complicated. Marriages, relationships, and so forth. So, that's the fascination of it. Fortunately, we have women as part of that mix, because they do bring a perspective and a richness that I think were we an all-male society, we would miss. So we were not and are not and won't ever be. In fact, the more likely scenario is an all-female society, because articles have been written about the fact you don't actually need the male in the system. So I don't know how my colleagues responded to that, but yes, people have ventured out on that. So I hope we keep males around for a while.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Enjoyed talking with you. Yeah. Sorry that I couldn't be there with your class. I think it's great.
No problem.
To be having such a class, and it's terrific that your students are interested, as they obviously are, in studying these issues, and look forward to learning more about the outcomes of your course.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. All done, or did you forget to turn it on?